Good evening. On behalf of the American Constitution Society, I would like to welcome you to the second in our series on sovereignty and status, the Puerto Rico's 2020 statehood referendum. For those of you who did not catch our first event, I would encourage you to check out our YouTube channel where you can find a recording of our event about DC statehood. And for those of you who are interested, we are in the process of planning events in this series on American Samoa and the citizenship case that's currently in the 10th Circuit, and then Native American rights and land issues. Those events will be forthcoming. I should also let you know that coming soon is a panel about election protection post-mortem, examining what worked and what didn't work for election protection efforts in 2020. I should also make special thank you to our co-sponsors for tonight's event, the lawyer chapters for Madison, the Bay Area, San Diego, Los Angeles, Austin, Houston, New York, and the student chapter from the American University Washington College of Law. Thank you very much for your co-sponsorship and welcome to your members. We're glad to have you. Now, without further ado, I will turn it over to our moderator for tonight, Patricio. It's all yours.
Thank you, Austin, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight to discuss a very timely issue and what promises to be a very engaging discussion. As Austin mentioned, my name is Patricio Martinez-Jumpart, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors for ACS's Lawyers Chapter here in Washington, D.C., and I'll be moderating tonight's panel. This past November, as some of you may know, Puerto Rico celebrated a non-binding referendum on the question of its future political status. And voters narrowly favored statehood, with 52% of voters supporting that option. This was the latest in a series of referendums that have taken place since the people of Puerto Rico adopted their own constitution and became a Commonwealth of the United States in 1952. Today, in many respects, the government of Puerto Rico enjoys an autonomy similar to that of the states. But as some of you may also know, in recent years, that autonomy has been diminished and questioned by several Supreme Court decisions, confirming that Puerto Rico remains subject to Congress's plenary powers under the federal Constitution's territorial clause, together with the enactment in 2016 of the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, better known as PROMESA, which put in place a financial oversight board that supervises the Commonwealth's finances. So to discuss all of this and more tonight, we're really fortunate to have a very distinguished panel that I'm sure is ready to engage in debate from multiple perspectives. And before getting started, I'll just do some brief introductions and we'll dive right into the questions. First, we have Rafael Cox-Alomar, who is a lawyer, professor, and author, a native of Puerto Rico and a former candidate for political office on the island. Professor Cox-Alomar now teaches at the David Clark School of Law here at the University of the District of Columbia. Also joining us is Jeffrey Farrow, who for decades has advised and represented Puerto Rico and other territories before the federal government. During the Clinton administration, Jeffrey served as President Clinton's principal advisor and coordinator of all federal policy and activities affecting Puerto Rico. And last, but certainly not least, we are joined by Professor Cristina Ponsa-Kraus, who's also Puerto Rican and a professor of law at Columbia Law School, where she specializes in the legal history of American empire and issues surrounding the political status of Puerto Rico and the other US territories. Unfortunately, Angel Nigaglioni is no longer able to join us tonight and he sends his excuses. So with that behind us, I think we're ready to get started. And the first question I have is directed to the whole panel. Throughout the night, I'll be sometimes directing questions to specific panelists, but we'll have the opportunity for each panelist to chime in and contribute to the discussion as they see. So just to get us started, and this goes to the whole panel, as I said, my first question is as follows. Following the results of the November 2020 referendum, should Puerto Rico become a state? Why or why not? Maybe we can start with Professor Ponsa.
Okay, my pleasure. So I want to first thank the ACS for the invitation to speak. It is an honor and a pleasure to be on a panel with such distinguished and knowledgeable speakers and moderator. So thank you. As to the question, it's a fair question, but I'm going to be difficult by saying that I would need to hear you say more. So my initial answer is forget following the November 2020 referendum. Puerto Rico should have been a state a long time ago. So sure, following the November 2020 referendum also. But at the same time, I would immediately want to qualify. So do I think Congress should force statehood on Puerto Rico at any time? No, I do think a majority vote for statehood is important, and we do have that in the November 2020 referendum. And when I say Puerto Rico should have been a state a long time ago, I don't want to convey the idea that somehow the United States should make this happen, regardless of what Puerto Ricans say. But my view is that really Puerto Rico should have had a choice between statehood and independence, join or leave. Simple and straightforward, and it should have had it, in the early 20th century, very soon after annexation. And let's go ahead and assume that, Puerto Rico should have been annexed. We can always talk about that too. But assuming that reality, Puerto Rico should have had a choice a long time ago. And over time, I think that the result of that choice would have been different. But for many, many, many decades, Puerto Ricans, while we disagree on so much, we have agreed overwhelmingly on the desirability of US citizenship. And when you have a population that, over 90% of the population agrees on the desirability of US citizenship and on the desirability of maintaining some kind of relationship with the United States, that involves the applicability of US sovereignty and federal law, then from my perspective, it's a no-brainer. That place ought to be a state. It ought to be a state. It ought to have equality, representation. I'm pretty basic when it comes to the importance of equal voting rights. So a majority vote, very important. We have that now. But I'll say one more thing. I think it's one question to ask a Puerto Rican, should Puerto Rico be a state? And it's a separate question to ask a fellow American, a congressperson or a member of the American public, should Puerto Rico be a state? And I think that it makes sense that Puerto Ricans have different views, and it is difficult. This is a challenging decision, and there are multiple considerations: historical, political, cultural, you name it. I don't dismiss it as an easy question if you're Puerto Rican. But if you are an American, a non-Puerto Rican American, the answer ought to be absolutely straightforward. Of course, we've had a colony for almost 125 years. We've been ruling them without giving them representation. I think on this side, on this end, on the mainland, the answer ought to be absolutely. Mañana, ayer, right away. What are we waiting for? This is embarrassing. This is an injustice. Okay, I'll stop there. Don't want to get too heated too quickly.
Just getting started. Thanks, Professor. Jeffrey, do you want to go next?
Sure, happy to. Let me start actually with some of your introduction in answering this question, in talking about the plebiscite that was held on November 3rd. You referred to it as a non-binding plebiscite. It's almost constitutionally impossible to have a binding plebiscite. The only binding plebiscites that have been held in the United States on political status of territories have been after Congress passed a statehood bill for a territory and then made the statehood bill contingent on the people of the territory accepting the statehood legislation. So I think there's a lot of confusion about the idea of having a non-binding or versus a binding plebiscite or any other binding process. it was mentioned that there have been previous plebiscites. This was the 6th that Puerto Rico has held. There was a plebiscite in 1967. There was a plebiscite in 1993, plebiscite in 1998. The fundamental problem with all of those plebiscites was that they included impossible proposals as options. And so they can't be considered to be valid plebiscites because something is only an option if it's possible to be implemented. And what was on the ballot in those 3 plebiscites, some of what was on the ballot was impossible. Puerto Rico had plebiscites in 2012 and 2017, which were limited to possible options, but there was a low level of participation. So members of Congress weren't convinced that there was a real mandate from Puerto Rico for statehood. There's no question about the mandate from the November 3rd plebiscite. Virtually as many people voted in the plebiscite as voted for governor, for resident commissioner, and for the at-large seats in the Legislative Assembly of Puerto Rico. So as many people who wanted to voted, and the choices were statehood yes or statehood no. So there was no debate about what the options were. The options were clear, and anyone who opposed statehood for any reason, and even if which could be they wanted some impossible governing arrangement, they want the status quo, they want independence, or they don't even want to discuss the issue, or they just don't like the party in power at the time in Puerto Rico. For whatever reason, people could vote no, but a majority of the people voted yes. The United States is the nation that championed started the concept of self-determination and championed that concept. Christina is right that it is not applied to Puerto Rico as it should have. It created the problem of Puerto Rico's status almost as soon as it took over the islands, and primarily because of the Philippines. Previous territories had always been put on the path to statehood. And because the United States took the Philippines along with Puerto Rico from Spain and along with Guam, but because of the Philippines, there was an unwillingness to consider Puerto Rico to be a part of the United States, a territory that was a part that would eventually become a state. And then after the Filipinos fought for independence, instead of seeking statehood, the United States extended citizenship to the people of Puerto Rico in 1917, and the purpose was to bind the territory to the United States so that Puerto Rico also would not want independence. And I would be very happy if Puerto Rico became independent. I'd be very happy if Puerto Rico became a nation in an association with the US that either nation could end. And I'd be happy if Puerto Rico became a state. But the people of Puerto Rico have clearly indicated that they want statehood in the plebiscites in 2012 and 2017, even though many people chose not to vote. They were free and fair elections. They were limited to real status possibilities, and people chose statehood in both of those votes. And in this very clear vote that was held November 3rd, there is a choice of statehood as well. My view has always been that Puerto Rico should have a democratic form of government, democratic governing arrangement, which it does not now, and the people of Puerto Rico should be treated equally by that government in whatever nation they choose. And they have made it clear time and again that the nation they choose is the United States. And it's not only in plebiscites. About 65% of the people of Puerto Rico now live in the States. And whether or not they think about this as a political status choice, what they have chosen is to not live in the territory, but live in a state for whatever reason. Most often it's economic, but that is a political status choice as well. So you've got 65%. I won't say all 65% are for statehood because they're not, but the overwhelming majority of Puerto Ricans in the states are for statehood. In a poll, there were a number of polls taken last year because the Puerto Rican vote in Florida in particular was considered to be a possible game changer in the presidential election. It certainly was in the Florida Senate and gubernatorial elections in 2018. And the candidates in 2018 who supported statehood more clearly were elected, and they were elected by very narrow margins. And the losers, and at least the Senator Bill Nelson, a veteran senator who lost, recognizes that he lost because he didn't express his support for statehood. For Puerto Rico, there are 1.2 million Puerto Ricans in Florida. It's the state with the largest number of Puerto Ricans out of the 5.8 million in the states. But up to 86% of all Puerto Ricans in the states, according to a good poll, said that they would be more likely to vote for a candidate who supported statehood for Puerto Rico. In Florida, statehood is supported by 81% of Puerto Ricans. In New York State, where there's a lot of support for Puerto Rico becoming a nation, but that a lot of support doesn't translate to the majority of Puerto Ricans in New York. It's 78% of New York Puerto Ricans, according to repeated polling, are for statehood for the territory. It's not only Puerto Ricans, however. Americans as a whole support statehood for Puerto Rico by a 2-to-1 margin over opposing statehood. Interestingly, you mentioned that you did a panel on DC, and there's a plurality of Americans who support statehood for DC, but again, a majority of the people of the states. And I use Americans referring to the people in the states in this context, as Christina did, because Puerto Ricans who live in Puerto Rico are Americans as well. So everybody should have the right to elect the people who make their laws, their national laws and their local laws. And as you explained in the beginning, right now, the federal government is making the most important local laws in Puerto Rico in addition to Puerto Rico's national laws. And everybody should be treated equally by their government. And there is only one status that offers that. If Puerto Ricans didn't want it and they wanted to be a nation, I would be all in favor, but they clearly want statehood. So that's, I think the United States has a responsibility after all of this period that Christina mentioned to give democracy and equality to Puerto Ricans in the nation of their choice.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Professor Cox-Elomar, should Puerto Rico become a state? Why or why not?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate the invitation. Very honored to have this discussion with distinguished colleagues and friends, Christina and Jeff. We might disagree on some areas, but fundamentally, we all share the same concern with Puerto Rico's current status. And I believe that obviously Puerto Rico must exercise its unalienable right to self-determination. And that has never happened. We were silenced in Paris while the McKinley administration was negotiating the Treaty of Paris with Spain. And we have been silenced today as Congress passed PROMESA in 2016 and has basically commandeered our lives ever since. Now, we need to parcel out a series of concepts and ideas, and perhaps I'm going to offer a more nuanced reading, perhaps a different reading on some aspects than Christina and Jeff. While substantively we all agree that Puerto Rico must exercise its right to self-determination, that Puerto Rico is a nation in itself, the procedure is very important. The legitimacy of the procedure is essential. And I believe that the local referendum that took place last November in Puerto Rico wasn't the proper path. The local referendum was enacted pursuant to a local legislation, Puerto Rico Law 51 of 2020, that was the product of a unilateral process in a smoke-filled room in the Puerto Rico legislature, authored by the ominous former president of the Puerto Rico Senate, Tomás Rivera Schatz, without any participation of any of the other political parties or ideological movements. Yes, there is sizable support for statehood, but yes, there's also a sizable opposition to statehood. If we go back in history, I think that in none of the 37 territories that acceded to the Union after the first 13 colonies was there as much opposition to statehood as there is in Puerto Rico. And that's something that requires, therefore, a more inclusive procedural path to seek our self-determination. I mean, the local referendum at no point involved Congress. The Puerto Ricans were basically those who voted for statehood. They did not know what the transition to statehood is going to look like, what's the timetable for statehood. Folks who opposed statehood were fundamentally silenced in the process. I agree with Christina that folks supporting sovereignty should have had a place on that ballot, that this should have been a concerted effort by all the political and ideological forces in Puerto Rico, that would have actually added strength to the argument that this is indeed a legitimate process. Mind you, the Department of Justice, in the summer of 2020, they came up, Jeff Rosen, Deputy Attorney General, came up with a forceful opposition to this process. Obviously, it is not essential for the DOJ to support Puerto Rico's search for self-determination, but nonetheless, the DOJ raised serious concerns, some of which I share. Those were the same concerns they raised in 2017, when close to 77% of the Puerto Rico electorate boycotted the 2017 referendum. And that's the challenge for Puerto Rico. While, to the degree that we cancel each other out, and I think Jeff has witnessed this intensely. I mean, Puerto Rican politicians, they tend to cancel each other out in Washington. They torpedo each other out. They basically sideline, they bypass each other out. And that is precisely the reason why Congress pays no attention whatsoever. And, countries, societies that do not learn from their history end up repeating the same mistakes. What's going to happen with the 2020 referendum in Washington is the same thing that happened with the 1967, the 1993, the 1998, the 2012, and the 2017. Nothing's going to happen, right? Because there is no consensus here in Puerto Rico with respect to the legitimacy of what happened in November. The government of Puerto Rico invested millions of dollars in this pro-statehood campaign. Folks opposing statehood hardly invested any money. It's just a miracle they were able to get 47, 48% of the votes. And this raises a lot of questions having to do with whether this was a legitimate process of self-determination. Now, Jeff made some observations which merit a closer look with respect to the previous exercises and the previous referenda. With respect to the 1967 referendum, And perhaps the 1993 referendum, the DOJ had not yet changed its views with respect to the possible enhancement of the Commonwealth status, which we now know is basically an impossibility. But at least in 1967, under the Johnson administration in Washington, DOJ had rendered a series of opinions, both in 1959 and in 1963, suggesting that there was no constitutional impediment for a mutual consent arrangement between the people of Puerto Rico and the Congress. So the 1967 plebiscite really wasn't a choice between possibilities, right? I mean, there was some legitimacy in light of what the DOJ had actually said it was possible. The DOJ then, in the hands at the end of the Bobby Kennedy tenure, that changed dramatically in the Clinton years after the DOJ under Janet Reno basically changed the dynamics and the legal argument with respect to Puerto Rico, right? And what happened next was just the demise of the whole idea that the Commonwealth could be enhanced, within the federal structure. But moving forward, and just wrapping up, just to move on to other topics and questions, the question you're posing, Patricio, has another angle. The question is not, do you want Puerto Rico to become a state, or do you think Puerto Rico will accede to the Union as a state? I guess the question also is Congress willing to make Puerto Rico a state right now? I mean, right now, the DC statehood process is just stalling in the House. It passed the House. I mean, nothing has happened in the Senate. For me, it's impossible to see a Puerto Rico 51st state without the DC question being solved first, just because of the dynamics in Washington. And the other thing is, I don't believe Puerto Rico could accede to the Union as a state so long as we have PROMESA, so long as the debt hasn't been restructured, and so long as we haven't been able to balance not even one annual budget. And I mean, there are a lot of very, very complex dynamics. That's why I think folks who sold the idea to the people of Puerto Rico that by voting yes here, they would achieve statehood tomorrow, I mean, that was just a complete exercise in fiction. And the Puerto Rico question is a very complex question. And I put to you, to finish, Puerto Rico says case study is unique in many ways. I mean, Jeff mentioned the Philippines, Christina mentioned other territories. I mean, Puerto Rico says case study really is unique within the US's constitutional tapestry.
Thank you, Professor. And that is a perfect transition to my next question to the panel, which is, what would need to happen for Puerto Rico to become a state? And this question I'm thinking about in several parts. And the first, I'm hoping that perhaps Professor Ponce can get us started with, but what are the constitutional requirements? What is the process like in very practical terms for Congress to admit a new state? And then from there, I think we can move on to the question that Professor Cox-Alomar just posed, which is more, what would need to happen for Congress to admit Puerto Rico as a state today, and the more practical political considerations of that dynamic. So if Professor Ponce, you could get us started with just a brief overview on the constitutional process and requirements, and then we can move on to the broader discussion of the political moment and the political times, and how that relates to the possibility of statehood today.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, this getting us started, the real challenge, I think, in Puerto Rico's case is, as Professor Cox-Alomar said, is its uniqueness. I consider Puerto Rico's unique situation really unfortunate. I think Puerto Rico has been trapped in an unending debate over exactly what its status is. I think that the creation of a When Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam were first annexed, as has been mentioned, I don't think all these details have been mentioned, but the Supreme Court created a new status for them. The United States had always had territories. The Supreme Court said these territories were different. They were not incorporated into the United States. They were not a part of the United States. And that status, unincorporated territorial status, is the status the territories have today. Puerto Rico became a Commonwealth in '52 with its own constitution, but it's still a territory and still not incorporated into the United States. And the battle over what that means, what does it mean about the applicability of individual constitutional provisions in Puerto Rico? What does it mean about the future of Puerto Rico? What implications does it have for citizenship, which Puerto Ricans didn't have until 1917, et cetera? These are, fascinating questions. And, I've built my career basically grappling with them, but I have felt pretty awful grappling with them for this long. And I'm currently trying to write something about how I'll never write about them again, because, they threw us a bone and here we are chasing it still. I mean, it's pretty brilliant what they did, we're just running, and incorporated, unincorporated, and what is this and what is that, and the nature of citizenship, birthright, due process, how about forget it already? So, but I'm very happy to be here to talk about these things anyway. And I'm trying to be concise because I just love hearing from my colleagues and want to keep hearing your questions. So to answer the actual question you posed, constitutionally, it's pretty straightforward. The Constitution has a territory clause, which empowers Congress to govern territories, and it has an admission clause, which empowers Congress to admit states. And Congress has the power to admit states by a simple majority vote. And the basic requirement that needs to be fulfilled is that an entering state has to be on an equal footing with other states. That is the nature of statehood. It is that inherent equality or sort of built-in equality of statehood that makes it appealing to me. And this is why, as Professor Cox-Salomar pointed out, promesa stands as a real obstacle to what can happen with Puerto Rico anytime soon. You cannot have a state run by a financial oversight and management board. So in the past, Congress's practice has sort of fleshed out this process in a little more detail. So Congress has governed territories with organic acts. Those are statutes that create governments for the territories. The original one was the Northwest Ordinance, which itself made a promise of statehood to the then current territories and set forth criteria that those territories had to meet, including population criteria that Puerto Rico exceeded upon annexation. The Northwest Ordinance assumed statehood, like every other annexation and organic act did. This is what happened with annexed territory in the United States until 1898. The process subsequent to that involves, and this is, the Constitution just has the one sentence: Congress has the power to admit territories. So Congress has gone about that by passing an enabling act, enabling the territory to initiate the process of statehood. That includes the adoption of a constitution, which Congress then has to approve, and then Congress can admit the state Congress admits the state with an admission act. So there's a sort of bullet point outline that is essentially, that applies to all the territories before 1898, and then some variations on the ground. Organic act to govern the territory, enabling act, territory adopts a constitution, which is supposed to be the step that leads to statehood. Congress approves that constitution and admits. The territories, some of them had referenda, others didn't. My understanding is that 13 did. Every single referendum was a yes or no. There were none of the plebiscites that Puerto Rico has had with a variety of options, because when you annex territory, you're going to make it a state. So the referenda were always yes or no. They're actually, Professor Cox-Salomar said that prior territories didn't oppose statehood to the extent that Puerto Ricans do, but actually I recently learned that Nebraska did. Statehood passed there by an extremely slim margin, pero eran cuatro gatos. I mean, there weren't that many people in Nebraska at the time, so there's that. But statehood has been contested. There were territories where there were votes on constitutions instead of statehood per se, and there was substantial opposition to those constitutions. But this was always, this is the key. Statehood, for US territories, statehood was a matter of when, not if. And for Puerto Rico, it became a matter of if, not when. When you make statehood a matter of if, not when, you are sending a message of rejection to the people that you have just annexed. You take them and you hold them, but you really don't want them. And I believe that Puerto Ricans have quite understandably reacted to this message with ambivalence and in some cases and with opposition. So when Puerto Rico was initially, and I'm going to stop soon. I want to hear what everybody else has to say. This was just supposed to be the basic intro on history, I know. But when Puerto Rico was annexed, the two political parties of the island both adopted pro-statehood platforms. Puerto Ricans had been seeking autonomy from Spain for many, many decades and had failed to get it until Spain at the very last minute on the eve of the United States declaring war on Spain, granted Puerto Rico. In fact, it granted Puerto Ricans more autonomy than they had been asking for. It granted that autonomy to Cuba as well, while Cuba was in the middle of fighting for its independence. So Puerto Rico had been fighting for autonomy for a long time and been continuously rejected until this sort of last minute gambit, which lasted, not very long at all, because then the United States declared war, annexed Puerto Rico, helped Cuba beat Spain and annex Puerto Rico. The political leaders of Puerto Rico, there's always been a small percentage that's in favor of independence, and some of those left, and some of those had to deal with the new reality. But the leaders representing the majority, the overwhelming majority of the people of Puerto Rico, were in favor of statehood and argued for it and said, okay, finally, now we've been annexed by a place that will give us autonomy, which to them was statehood. Okay, so that statehood gets us what we've always wanted: equal representation in the national legislature and local self-government. And it was upon Congress's failure to grant US citizenship, as everyone expected, and then the Supreme Court's rubber stamping of this new different thing where we take the territory, but it's not on its way to statehood, and their people aren't citizens, but they are American because they're not foreigners, and this craziness. Supreme Court rubber stamps this and invents this new unincorporated territory, and then divisions emerged. And now there's some people who want statehood and some people who don't, and there we are trapped still. And as I was saying before, I'm a little obsessed with this point now. We've just been at each other ever since. So a basic pattern that not justified. If you're going to annex a place, then you better give it equality, okay? That is the pattern that was broken with in 1898 and with the way that the United States treated Puerto Rico. So it's simple and straightforward in its basic constitutional outlines, not to diminish political battles around the race of the inhabitants of new territories. This country has a serious problem with race, and it had it even with the territories that became states. But this complexity of this other option, and who are we, and what are we, and do we belong or don't we belong, et cetera, that is for, we are unique in that respect. The current territories are unique in that respect in a general sense, and then each one has its own version of it, Puerto Rico included. So simple constitutionally, extremely complex politically.
And that again is the perfect leeway to the second part of the question, which is the political realities surrounding statehood and Congress moving to do something about it and to make it a reality after this past referendum. And maybe Jeff can get us started on this side of the coin. But what are your views on what would need to happen for Congress to finally act decisively for statehood or for another non-territorial option?
Well, what's required for statehood and what's required for another non-territorial option, which would be a nationhood option, I think are two different things. And as Christina explained, this is really a discretionary decision on the part of the Congress. And so there are a lot of Democrats right now, nationally, who are in favor of admitting both Puerto Rico and DC as states, for much of the reason that several states have been admitted in the past, which is politics. And Democrats dislike, and many progressive people, liberal people dislike the fact that our country has a Senate that's not very representative of the population, because you have a lot of sparsely populated, small populations, states that are rural and in the West in particular, who have 2 senators, and then you have California and New York and so forth. And so they see, and that affects, of course, the Electoral College. And so a lot of folks see that Puerto Ricans are Americans from the American point of view. Not everybody in Puerto Rico looks at it that way, but from the American point of view, that is the case. And Puerto Rico should be a state. And if it were, then there would be more of the Senate and the Electoral College would be more representative of the population. I have to, Patricio, address a couple of things that have been said before. And let me, before I do that, let me just say, I think Joe Biden got it right, the president-elect, a couple of weeks before the plebiscite, when he said that if Puerto Ricans vote for statehood, the United States federal government must respect and act on that decision, and end quote. So there's mention of self-determination. There is no more pure self-determination than the elected representatives of a people putting a question to the people, a simple question to the people, and the people answering that question. So I think Puerto Rico has exercised self-determination. There's a mention about the division, and Christina touched on this as well, but I just want to note one thing. The statehood process actually started for a territory that voted against statehood. And there were other territories where there was support for independence. And that in one territory, there was a support for the idea of Commonwealth. But the process—
Wait, seriously? Which one?
In Alaska.
Of course, right. After Puerto Rico became a Commonwealth? Okay,
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Became quote unquote a Commonwealth. Congress was not involved. Well, Congress hasn't been involved in any of the initial petitions for statehood from any territory. And as a matter of fact, not all 37 areas that became states after the original 13 were territories before they became states. And congressional involvement, which I personally am in favor of, because I think the Congress needs to help clarify options. But Congress did enact a law, and I'll get to that in a second. It was said that there was no explanation of a transition to statehood. That's true, although the law for the plebiscite in Puerto Rico referred to a transition plan being drafted. And I don't think you can have a serious transition plan worked out by the United States government until Puerto Rico or territory chooses either statehood or nationhood. It is the next step, it seems to me, for Puerto Rico to become a state, which is more related to your question, is for a transition plan to be drafted. That's what's called for in Puerto Rico law. That's what I think the federal government ought to do next, is provide for that transition. And it ought to, and I think would, want to have another vote in Puerto Rico after Puerto Ricans saw what the transition provided, another vote to confirm their desire for statehood and to confirm their desire for the terms of the transition. And Puerto Rico would have a more complicated transition than any previous territory. The people opposed to statehood were certainly not silenced in this plebiscite. There's an active campaign to vote no, and the results were what they were. The Department of Justice opposed the plebiscite after the law was enacted. I agree actually with some of the things the Department of Justice said, but none of them negate the reality and the validity of the plebiscite. And the two main arguments that the Department of Justice made against the plebiscite law that they were being asked to comment on was that they were not given enough time to comment. The law was enacted on May 18th, and they were given a deadline of June 30th, and they said that was not enough time for them to respond to Puerto Rico. And actually, the government of Puerto Rico did not submit the request to the Department of Justice, if I recall correctly, until June 6th. And even on June 6th, it didn't submit all of the information that it needed to submit. So that was the primary option that the Justice Department had. The other main option that the Justice Department had that I don't think any of us on this panel would support is that the Justice Department wanted the current status to be a separate option on the plebiscite. They weren't talking about independence or free association. The only option that they thought needed to be on the ballot was the current status. And of course, the current status was represented in a no vote, just as nationhood would be. Just final 2 points. It is true that in 1967, when the plebiscite was held, the Department of Justice thought that it would be constitutional for the United States to enter into a binding arrangement with a territory. And as Professor Cox-Alamar pointed out, the Justice Department changed that view. It didn't change it in the Clinton administration, however. It changed that view actually in the Reagan administration. And even before that, there was legislation to implement the results of the 1967 plebiscite in the early 1970s. And that legislation was rejected in the Congress. And even before that, the Johnson administration, the Kennedy and Johnson administrations rejected the concept themselves. So the federal government has never, despite the Department of Justice having a memorandum from an associate attorney general, the US federal government has never accepted the proposition of a status that is not nationhood or statehood or territory. So, what's going to happen now is, I think, will be determined in the next weeks and months. Certainly, there will be statehood legislation introduced in the House as well. And I think the big question is, do Democrats want to force statehood legislation through the Congress for both DC and Puerto Rico? It's an unresolved question. The Democrats aren't united on it, but there are a lot of people who are thinking about this is the time to correct the imbalance in the representation of the American people in the Senate and in the Electoral College.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Professor Cox-Alamar, if you want to say a word on this question, but I also think it would be great if you could transition us to my following question, which has to do with the current status and whether the status quo is acceptable and a sustainable option in the short term or the long term, however you want to approach it. You're muted, Professor.
the current status of Puerto Rico, if you can call it status, I mean, Puerto Rico's status never changed since 1898. We remained an unincorporated territory of the United States. That's pretty obvious. But the current situation is an embarrassment to the people of Puerto Rico, and it is an embarrassment to the Congress of the United States, right? So that's something that's perhaps one of the basic ideas that unite us all, right? Both here in Puerto Rico and in the mainland as well, right? Folks in the diaspora. I'm going to address just a few interesting points my colleagues have brought forth. The first one is when I say there was no congressional involvement here, what I mean by congressional involvement is in the case of the territories that acceded to the Union is Congress was involved to the degree that the Senate ratified the annexation treaties that led these territories to the Union, right? So linking what Christina and Jeff were mentioning, if you go back to the founding of the Republic, you're gonna realize that the idea that Congress possessed plenary authority to annex territory either by treaty or by conquest. I mean, that's an idea that antedates the Constitution, right? Chief Justice Marshall wrote about this. Even before the insular cases, it was pretty obvious. Congress did enjoy plenary authority to regulate life in the territories. And there was a conscious decision. If you go to the 1803 treaty with Napoleon, the 1819 treaty with Ferdinand VII, pursuant to which the Florida territory was annexed. If you go to the Guadalupe Hidalgo treaties, if you go to the Oregon treaty, to the treaty with Alaska, 1867, even if you go to the treaty between the United States and Denmark, pursuant to which the United States bought the UBI, there was specific language with respect to citizenship. And in the case of the other territories, there was specific language with respect to the path to statehood, right? And the Senate of the United States ratified each of these treaties. Therefore, there was, as a threshold matter, congressional involvement because the path had been opened ab initio for these territories to accede eventually at some point. It was a matter of when, it wasn't a matter of if, to quote Professor Duffy Ponsa. It was a matter of when they would accede to statehood, not if they were going to accede to statehood. So in the case of Puerto Rico, the reason why that did not happen had to do, among other things, with the sociological realities and the demographic realities and the linguistic realities, and the record is pretty clear. Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam. And I think that that point must be looked at carefully. Now, with respect to the political landscape, in the aftermath of 1898, the political landscape was very complex. Yes, Muñoz Rivera and Barbosa initially, when they founded the Republican Party and Muñoz Rivera the Federal Party, Barbosa immediately embraced statehood. Muñoz Rivera was always on a state of permanent vacillation, self-rule, statehood or independence. He was just very equivocal. I mean, folks like Jose de Diego, who was a very powerful leader within the Unionista Party, he was pro-independence, Rosendo Matienzo Cintrón as well. By the time we get to the 30s, El Partido Liberal, which was the second most important party, was fundamentally independentista, right? By the time we get to the 1950s, 1952, the second most important party on that election was the Independence Party, got near 20% of the votes. Albizu Campos had been around since the 30s. He had also participated in the electoral process, and he had received important support in his candidacy to become senator at large in 32. So the political landscape internally hasn't been so clear-cut, right? And there has always been this anti-statehood front, but without a cohesive idea in terms of whether to wholeheartedly support independence, which never materialized, or whether to somehow articulate a sovereign solution that could pass muster under the constitutional landscape of the United States and be amenable to the people of Puerto Rico. So, with respect to your question, going back to your question, one, Puerto Rico's current status is completely unacceptable. Two, Puerto Rico's status never changed. What happened in 1952 was that Congress delegated some authority to Puerto Rico over local matters, right? Governor of Puerto Rico, for the first time in our history, would appoint the justices of the Supreme Court. We would have a legislature with more autonomy to do things, and the governor had a wider radius of action to do things, but still we were an unincorporated territory of the US. And what happened in 2016 was that finally, the Puerto Rico politicians, they bankrupt Puerto Rico. The whole Puerto Rico model was destroyed, and Congress just had to take away what it delegated in 52. Now we have this fiscal control board that basically legislates and executes and is plenary in its authority over the daily lives of Puerto Ricans, more so than the Washington board of the 90s. And the future of Puerto Rico right now is very uncertain. Hurricane Maria, COVID, the earthquakes, Promesa, we still haven't finished renegotiating more than half of the debt. Puerto Rico hasn't been able to balance not even a budget since God knows how many years. So the economy is obviously hurt, not just because of the COVID, but obviously also because of the earthquakes and Hurricane Maria and the like. And now, we have a divided government that was just inaugurated last week. We have a legislature where there are no decisive majorities either way. We have a governor who won with only 31% of the votes. He hardly has a mandate to do things, right? And then he has to negotiate with this legislature on the one hand and with the board on the other, right? So the situation right now is pretty complex.
Thank you, Professor. Before we go on, I just want to make a quick housekeeping point. We welcome questions from the audience. For all attendees, you should be able to submit questions through the chat. We have set aside some time to answer and address those questions towards the end. So with that, I want to move on to my next question to the panel, which is, and this is again related to the question we were just addressing. Besides statehood, what other options are available for Puerto Rico outside of the territorial clause? And I think we can here go back to Jeffrey's point from his introductory remarks of the other sorts of arrangements that other island nations and other territories have established with the federal government.
So let me answer very briefly and just reiterate. And I've worked on status regarding all of the territories, and 3 of them are now states in free association with the United States, which means that they are nations which have delegated to the United States the exercise of some of their sovereign powers on the condition that they can unilaterally declare independence. These are 3 areas that were parts of a territory in the Pacific Islands. Full disclosure, I'm representing one of those governments right now in renegotiating its free association with the United States. What the United States gets out of the deal is it has effective strategic defense military control of the islands. And in return, it gives a substantial amount of assistance, and it gives the people of the islands free access to the United States without regard to immigration. The United States did not, however, agree to the concept of US citizenship for them, because since they can declare independence unilaterally under free association, the US wouldn't want to have a nation populated entirely by US citizens. There's obviously the status of independence and statehood. Those are the three possible options. Let me just add, I want to concur in almost everything that my friend Raphael said. I would note, however, and I agree with him, in essence, it was the Congress that imposed promesa on Puerto Rico, but in point of fact, it was the governor of Puerto Rico who was responsible for that action and came up with the concept of promesa and lobbied for it. And that's why it was imposed. And as a matter of fact, it was a member of Congress of Puerto Rican origin who persuaded the Democrats in Congress, who were reluctant to approve promesa, because promesa did not have majority support among Republicans or Democrats. But in the end, it was the US government acting unilaterally, although for the historical record, Puerto Ricans should know that a governor of Puerto Rico, his representatives, his lobbyists, his financial advisors came up with the concept and sold it to the US Treasury Department. But I've answered as well what the options are, and I don't think there will be any difference among my colleagues in what the options for Puerto Rico are. If there are, I'd be interested to hear them.
Professor Ponsa, Professor Ponsalomar, anything else you want to add?
Well, I don't think I have much to add. I think that Puerto Rico has two basic options. It has statehood and it has independence. And with independence can come a free association treaty of the kind that Jeff described. That's it. There are no other non-territorial options, and you can't decolonize by remaining a territory. So the options are statehood or independence.
Professor Cox-Salomar, do you concur?
Yes, let me just go into further detail. Yes, as soon as Puerto Rico, if Puerto Rico were to become a state, obviously Congress's authority under the plenary, Congress's authority under the territorial clause would cease, right? Now, if Congress were to relinquish its authority over Puerto Rico would accede to independence, right? So both under statehood and full independence, Puerto Rico would rid itself of Congress's plenary powers under the territorial clause, right? So what's the other option? What's the third way? The third way is free association. Now, what is free association? Free association is a political status whereby the people of Puerto Rico delegate, in the exercise of their own sovereignty, they delegate certain authority, a quantum of authority to the United States in some areas, and the people of Puerto Rico reserve authority over other areas. Everything will be subject to negotiation. And case studies of free association arrangements are found in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, in the British former possessions, in the Dutch possessions in the Caribbean, even the Danish in Greenland, and the Finnish and the Swedish in the islands, in the Baltic Sea. I mean, there are a host of different arrangements. Now, the challenge for the United States and for Puerto Rico is that Puerto Rico's historical path and Puerto Rico's legal path and Puerto Rico's, if you will, geopolitical path vis-a-vis the United States is different from what happened with the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the FSM, and Palau. I mean, these were territories that were placed on a UN trust. The United States was the trustee. Those territories were never under the territorial clause of the US Constitution. United States has never exercised or purported to exercise plenary authority over these territories. The legal nature of that relationship is different. folks living and folks inhabiting the Pacific territories were never citizens of the United States. Nor are they millions of people, nor do they have a diaspora of millions of folks with US citizenship living in the United States. So the challenge is somehow adopting the free association model to the Puerto Rican reality. And that will require a lot of tinkering. If we really want to make sure that the options available to the people of Puerto Rico somehow reflect the realities of a very unique relationship that has bound Puerto Rico to the United States. I mean, the free association path hasn't been fully explored in Puerto Rico. There's a lot of confusion with its scope, what it means. But as a concept, free association is not foreign to US domestic constitutional law, nor is it foreign to public international law, right? As the ICJ itself has represented in the Western Sahara advisory opinion in the 70s and in other declarations and opinions it has rendered, right? So free association, independence, and statehood. And again, I agree with Jeff and Christina. For me, including the status quo on any ballot is a non-starter. And I take to task the DOJ for proposing this. It might be constitutional pursuant to America's constitutional landscape, the territorial status, but it is undignified and it is the source, the root of our problem. We will not be able to solve this embracing the problem. We need to basically get rid of the problem.
Thank you, Professor. This next question I will direct to Jeffrey, but of course, everyone, I welcome everyone's thoughts. And this shifting our focus a little bit from Congress and the high-level discussion we've been having about the possibilities that are out there for Puerto Rico's future. In the short term, what role could the president, the incoming administration, and the executive branch play not only in finding solutions to the status debate, but also addressing some of the inequities that result from the current territorial status?
Well, let's start with the easier part first, which is addressing the inequities, which are in programs and tax laws. And so it's relatively easy if a president wants to propose changes in laws. President-elect Biden has proposed to treat Puerto Rico equally in supplemental security income, which is aid to the impoverished, aged, and disabled. And he's proposed equal treatment of Puerto Rico in Medicaid, and he's proposed equal treatment of Puerto Rico in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, often referred to as food stamps. And with a Democratic Congress, I think there's a fair chance a lot of this will be done. In terms of the status issue, there's a lot of talk about Congress needs to do this, Congress needs to do that. The reality is that Congress most often responds to what a president proposes. Sometimes it acts on its own initiative, but it's difficult to do that from the Congress. That's actually why, after being staff director of the House Subcommittee on Territories, I accepted the job in the Clinton White House, because I knew that a president would need to lead on this. We had congressional committee chairmen try to lead, but you really need the leader of the party as a whole to do the leading. So I think the question now is whether President Biden will fulfill his commitment, which is to respect and act on the results of the plebiscite in Puerto Rico, respecting the results means you have to recognize that a majority of the people voted for statehood. Now, acting on the results, I think there's more range for what action consists of. At the one extreme would be that the president says, let's make Puerto Rico a state right now, or proposes a plan for statehood. But I think another option, however, is to address what would need to occur to make Puerto Rico a state. And there are dozens upon dozens of federal laws that would need to be changed. The US budget would need to change. The budget of Puerto Rico would need to change. These changes can't be made overnight. There is a transition required. So what the president could really do that would be most helpful is to help craft a transition plan for Puerto Rico. And as I said earlier, the transition plan, I think, ought to be voted on by the people of Puerto Rico. And the question, I think, will then be, at the end of the transition, should there be another vote on the issue of the actual admission? Is Puerto Rico ready? But again, most specifically, in answer to your question, the president, I think at this point, needs to think about how do we, if a majority of the people want to go in this direction, how do we get there, and what are the markers along the way? Let me mention about the freely associated states of the Pacific very briefly. They were not governed under the territory clause, but they were governed under a trusteeship agreement, as Professor Cox-Alamar mentioned, that gave the United States absolute control over the trust territory entities that became the current freely associated state nations. And there are other models of free association in the world that vary from free association that the US has with the trust territory entities that have now become freely associated. But the key is the Constitution of the United States, and our Constitution is different from that of other countries. And unless we're going to amend the Constitution and basic laws and policies of the United States, then we have to follow those strictures. And they don't allow for, in the US case, they wouldn't allow for a nation of 3.2 million Americans. It's a separate nation where the US would then be taxing, the US taxes its citizens who live in other countries. It drafts them. It has to protect their rights and intervene in the affairs of another country to protect their rights. This issue has been looked at by the Clinton administration, the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration. They all have seen it pretty much the same way. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Jeffrey. And this is going to be our last question before we go on to some of the really good questions we've received from the audience. And I'll be directing this to Professor Ponce and Professor Cox-Alamar. Similar question as the one that I just asked Jeffrey, but with reference to the federal courts. What is the role, if any, for the federal courts in advancing a change in the status of Puerto Rico in the long term, or perhaps more immediately addressing some of the inequities that result from the current status? And here, as you're probably imagining, I'm thinking of cases like Baello Madero, which it's currently pending before the Supreme Court, and was on a ruling from the First Circuit, which found that the exclusion of Puerto Rico from supplemental Social Security is unconstitutional. I'm also thinking of cases like Aurelius, which was decided last summer by the Supreme Court and had to do with the Financial Oversight Board. And on that point, we actually got a question from the audience about Justice Sotomayor's concurrence in Aurelius, where she suggested that the 1952 legislation that allowed for the passage of the Puerto Rico Constitution created a species of irrevocable compact between the U.S. and Puerto Rico. So maybe you can address a mix of all of this in your responses.
So I'll try to do that and at the same time be brief because there really are a lot of good questions. So hopefully we'll get to a few more before we run out of time. I think there's basically, two basic questions one could ask about the role of the courts. Can they affect the status problem at heart? Can they solve the question of what options there are, or somehow make an option happen? I don't think they can make any option happen. Obviously, that's a political question. But the Supreme Court could overrule the cases that gave rise to the second-class territorial status that Puerto Rico and the current territories are in, the unincorporated territorial status. There, as Professor Cox-Salomar pointed out, there were territories all along. I talked about them too. This idea that some are incorporated into the United States and others aren't was an invention in 1901. The court could certainly overrule that if the occasion presented itself, and there are ways in which it could have the opportunity. The occasion could present itself to the court. If it did that, well, we'd still have territorial status, so we would still have a political problem, although the Supreme Court has said that what's distinctive about an incorporated territorial status is that those territories are not on their way to statehood necessarily. Once you eliminate that idea, then we're back to, well, they can choose to be states or they can be independent. So I think there would be a lot to be gained from the Supreme Court saying no more unincorporated status. We're done with that invention. I could say more, but like I said, I'm going to try to be brief. So there's the second kind of question. I'll just really say briefly about the Vaello Madero kind of case, the cases that are challenging the unequal treatment of the territories in terms of benefits. There have also been cases on absentee voting. Why can U.S. citizens abroad vote absentee, but not when they move to Puerto Rico in federal elections, et cetera. Those issues, particularly I would say the benefits issues, the need in Puerto Rico is so intense. It's just outrageous that Puerto Rico is treated unequally in terms of benefits, given the level of poverty and need on the island. So I am all in favor of court decisions addressing that inequity, as the ones in the courts now have done. They don't solve the ultimate problem, and so they can only accomplish what they can accomplish. I've always thought that if the Supreme Court were to say you can no longer treat the territories unequally in benefits, Congress would lose its appetite for this arrangement. But I think that the territories ought to be treated equally in benefits for the simple reason that that's the right thing to do. So I'll leave it at that.
Let me answer your question by saying that historically, federal courts have been very, very shy at addressing any of the inequities surrounding the territorial condition. And it is with a very, very heavy heart that I have to say this. I mean, when Justice Kennedy in Boumediene said that the political branches under our system have no right to switch on and off the Constitution. It is very sad what happened in Aurelius. And it's very sad what has happened in every step along the way. The trial by fire of Joe Biden and his Department of Justice, Merrick Garland, and folks at the Solicitor General's office will be deciding whether they will oppose Puerto Rico's plight for equality under both Vaello, which the court has been looking into to see if they're going to issue cert. I don't know what happened. I thought they were going to look at this on January the 8th. I don't know what happened. They were going to look at this in December.
It was relisted. They still haven't acted. It's been relisted like 3 times.
I know it was, it has been looked at, and they haven't decided whether to issue the cert. Now, what would happen if they issue cert what's the Biden administration going to do? Are they going to do the same thing Obama did in Windsor? Not contest this, or are they going to act like the Trump administration would have done and oppose this, right? That's going to be the first trial by fire. Not only Vallejo, but in the pipeline, we also have Peña Martinez. Peña Martinez was decided a couple of months ago at the federal district court level. It's going to go to the circuit, and I'm sure, depending, the circuit, depending what the circuit does with it, but Peña Martinez is even bigger than Vallejo. Peña Martinez has to do with SNAP, Medicare Part D, and a bunch of other programs, right? So one thing the courts can do is realizing that what has been done with Puerto Rico doesn't pass equal protection muster even under minimum scrutiny, right? And like Christina suggests, I mean, yes, folks like Justice Breyer, if you go to Breyer's comments in oral argument in Aurelius, you're gonna see that Breyer concurred with the late George Torruella that the insular cases are like a dark cloud hovering all over us, but they do nothing about it. And for some reason, the court hasn't realized that the insular cases are alive and kicking, and that the insular cases were, right, left, and center in Aurelius. And what happened in Aurelius goes to show that the court still doesn't seem to get what's going on. And then you ask about Justice Sotomayor. I know that Christina wrote an amazing piece, a very provocative piece in the Yale Law Journal Forum. And yes, I mean, Justice Sotomayor raises some very tough questions.
Thanks for that. I completely forgot to mention it.
That's right. It's old wine in new legal bottles or something.
Political wine in judicial bottles. I didn't agree with Sotomayor at all.
But Justice Sotomayor raises some very tough questions. No one has answered those questions. Yes, I mean, the United States through Ambassador Cabot Lodge and Mason Sears, arguments and representations were made before the United Nations. A cessation memorandum was drafted on behalf of the United States. That Puerto Rico had acceded to a new dimension in the federal superstructure, etc. That Puerto Rico was no longer a territory pursuant to Article 73E of the Charter of the United Nations, etc. And now, we know what happened. Again, the notion that the Congress could enter into compacts, the idea that there is a legal concept of a covenant that is not alterable, but with the mutual consent of both parties, antedates the founding of the Republic, right? The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 replicates that scheme. And the United States has made representations in some arenas, and it has made different representations in other arenas, and there's a huge confusion. The First Circuit created a mythology, right, under Judge Magruder and Judge Bones and Judge Campbell and even Judge Breyer, who drafted Chase Manhattan Bank, right, that somehow something had happened in Puerto Rico, that we were no longer a territory to be ruled by organic acts. Now we know that's not true, right? I mean, and the questions Sotomayor, the series of questions she raised, I mean, those are relevant, tough questions. I don't think she has infused new life on the Commonwealth formulation. I know folks here in Puerto Rico, some folks here believe that somehow Sotomayor has just, resurrected Commonwealth status. I don't see it that way. I think that's reading far too much into it. More so, she voted with a majority in Aurelius. Right? I mean, it's a concurrent opinion. It looks like a dissent, but it's no dissent. She concurred fully. I mean, she could have dissented, but she did not, right? So, I guess that's what, I guess that's what the challenge is with the Sotomayor opinion. Right? And, and I think that perhaps, other colleagues should reply to Christina's article and engage in that conversation.
We could go on for hours, but before we run out of time, there are some really good audience questions. Thank you to all of you who have submitted. And we're just going to try go through some that we got on the list. The first one shouldn't be too hard. Jeffrey, they're asking whether some of the surveys and polls that you cited during your opening remarks, whether those have been made public and whether they could find them somewhere online.
Absolutely. They're all public polls that have been done by major polling organizations, pollsters for the Biden campaign, for the Obama campaign, for the Hillary Clinton campaign, the Gallup organization. There's at least a dozen polls, more than a dozen polls, have all had pretty consistent findings, and they're all public.
Great. Another question that we've received, and this whoever wants to answer it, I think we can deal with one answer and then try to move on to another question. But it says, what kind of Missouri compromise, which I understand to have been part of all the recent state admissions, is possible for Puerto Rico and DC statehood?
So I think that's a good question, but I have to say I'm in favor of never doing another Missouri compromise. And I don't mean to be snarky, but there's no compromise necessary. We're talking about US citizens who have no voting rights, 1 state, 2 states, whatever. So there is stuff you could say about the likelihood that DC will be Democratic forever. It's certain. The likelihood that Puerto Rico will be Democratic forever, good enough, but not as certain as with DC probably. So what? These are people, so what? These are US citizens. Either they vote or we let them go.
Okay. Another question that we got, which is very different to that last one, but someone would like to hear from the panel's recommendations on books or other sorts of media that would provide, for those who are not too familiar with Puerto Rico's history and its relationship to the U.S., a good overview of that history and the current reality.
Well, one of the best overviews is Jose Trias Monge says The Oldest Trials. The
Trials of the Oldest
Colony in the World, published in 1997 by Yale Press University. Chief Justice Trias died in 2001, so it's not up to date till Promesa, but gives you a proper historical overview written by someone who was there at the forefront of Puerto Rico's history in the 50s and onwards till his death. Sam Ehrman came up with another interesting book published by Cambridge Press last year.
Almost Citizens, it's called.
That's right, Cambridge University Press.
Fantastic.
I'll add another book. The 2 books that I recommend most are Trias's and The Supreme Court in Puerto Rico by the late Judge Torrea. And another book that I would recommend, and I don't remember the title, was written by Nestor Dupre about the efforts that the late Governor Muñoz Marín made pretty secretly with the Kennedy White House and ultimately the Johnson White House to try to get a enhanced or perfected Commonwealth and the failures there.
That book, Nestor has written a series of books, but perhaps you're referring to Conversaciones en el Bohío.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a Muñoz Marín reminiscing what he did in the 60s and how he dealt with the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. That was published around 2006 or so.
Mm-hmm.
I would also add, so definitely Trias Monge, Puerto Rico, the Trials of the Oldest Colony in the World, and Torruella, Puerto Rico and the Supreme Court, the Doctrine of Separate and Unequal. I would also recommend for somebody who really wants kind of the nuts and bolts of the Puerto Rican status specifically, so not just historical overview, but what is this disagreement about? Nancy Morris, it's called Puerto Rico, Culture, Politics, and Identity. She's not Puerto Rican. She's interested in Scotland. She went and did a bunch of focus groups, and she did an amazing job of understanding fairly the broad range of perspectives and really explaining it for a novice. What do these people actually disagree about? She wrote, before the current status and the idea of a compact took the blows that it has taken from the Supreme Court recently, but still it's a good introduction to the status debate.
Another book that folks who are interested in the territories in general might want to look at is by Arnold Leibovitz, Defining Status. That was published by Niehoff Publishers, Dutch publishers. But Leibovitz's book, addresses the whole range of territories. Again, it was published, decades ago, but it's a good background.
Great. Well, thank you all for that. We unfortunately, I think we're out of time, but I want to again thank this incredible panel. We could keep going on for hours on this, and it's been a real pleasure and a lot of fun to engage in discussion with you. And thanks to all of our participants, and sorry that we didn't get through more questions. But with that, as Austin was saying in the beginning of the event, this is the second in a series of panels that ACS is organizing around issues affecting the territories and other underrepresented communities and parts of the US. In the next few months, we'll have another event on the question of American Samoa and US citizenship. And that will be followed by another event on tribal rights and ownership over their lands. So stay tuned for more details on that. I also want to take a second to thank the co-sponsors who supported this event tonight. And thank you all again for joining us. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me and all of us. And it's good being on the panel with
Absolutely.
and Rafael.
Thank you.
Bye.